I am the only person alive who knows that the police sketch of the armed man who desecrated St. Michael's Chapel is a perfect, almost photographic likeness of an archangel. The words feel like ash in my mouth, heresy on my tongue, but the truth burns hotter than any hellfire. It's been weeks since that Tuesday afternoon, and the image still haunts me, not from a sacred text, but from a mugshot board, tacked next to notices for stolen bicycles and missing pets. Every time I glimpse it, every time I remember the detective's earnest plea for information, a cold, impossible dread grips me. Because for them, it's an unsolved felony, a violent intervention by an unknown assailant. For me, it's a holy card, a paradoxical icon of the moment a violent crime was stopped cold by a blinding, silent, and terrifying act of God. The sketch. It's what breaks me. You see, I've spent my life studying the divine. I've read treatises on angels, discussed their hierarchies, their roles, their very nature. I've seen countless artistic representations, gilded wings, serene faces, flowing robes. Never once did I imagine one would manifest in such brutal, unyielding reality, let alone be distilled into charcoal lines on a piece of paper, circulated by the local constabulary. But there it is, every sharp line of the jaw, every intense curve of the eye that the victim, old Mrs. Gable, described to the police. They think it's a second man, a vigilant citizen perhaps. They have an open case file, a confused witness, and a baffling lack of physical evidence for this mysterious intervener. But I know the truth. The robber never laid a hand on her, and no second man was ever there. There was only a boy with a gun, an old woman with her rosary, and a light so powerful it nearly stopped my heart. The first time I saw the sketch, Detective Harding slapped it down on my desk, looking pleased, almost triumphant. "Father Michael, good news. Mrs. Gable, bless her, she's stronger than she looks," gave us a surprisingly clear description. Our guy, the one who stepped in, he sounds like he belongs in a movie. Tall, powerful build. Almost too perfect, she said. Here's the composite. My breath hitched. The blood drained from my face. I remember struggling to keep my hands from trembling, to keep my voice even. Harding, ever the pragmatist, mistook my reaction for shock at the violence of the event. He didn't see the terror in my eyes, the dawning, soul-shattering recognition of something that should not, could not be. He just patted my shoulder, oblivious to the fact that his good news was ripping the very fabric of my understanding of the cosmos to shreds. "Quite the hero, huh?" he'd said, gathering his papers. Not a scratch on the old lady. The perp just dropped his weapon and fell to his knees. Never seen anything like it. This second man must have been a force of nature. A force of nature. Oh, detective, you have no idea. How do you explain to a man of law and order that the face he's hunting, the face drawn with such painstaking scientific precision by a police artist from a shaken old woman's eyewitness account, is the visage of a celestial being? How do you articulate the utterly terrifying beauty of a justice that descends from heaven, silent as light, overwhelming as judgment? You don't. You simply don't. I couldn't. I can't. Not yet. My silence has been a burden, a heavy cloak woven from awe and fear. A priest is meant to speak of God, to interpret his will, to shepherd his flock. But what happens when God's will manifests in a way that defies all interpretation, all human logic, all theological convention? What happens when an angel intervenes not with a whisper or a dream, but with an act of such immediate, physical, and undeniable power that it leaves a police sketch in its wake? I am a priest. I believe in miracles. I preach of them, celebrate them, find solace in their existence. But this was different. This was raw. This was a direct incision into the mundane, a tear in the veil that usually separates the sacred from the profane. It wasn't a gentle blessing. It was an act that made the very air crackle with impossible energy. An event so absolute it redefined everything I thought I knew about divine intervention. The police think a second man intervened. They search for fingerprints that aren't there, for witnesses who didn't see, for motives that simply do not exist in their earthly purview. They call it an unsolved case. I call it a revelation, a terror, a gift. Mrs. Gable, bless her devout soul. She still speaks of a light. She attributes her survival to her lifelong devotion, to the Blessed Mother, to St. Michael, patron of our chapel. She knows something happened, something beyond human comprehension. But her piety filters it, softens it, makes it palatable for her aging heart. She saw the light, she felt the presence, but she didn't quite grasp the impossible specifics, the stark, muscular reality that the police sketch artist managed to capture so flawlessly from her terrified yet precise memory. But I saw it all. I was there, and I know. I cannot remain silent forever. This burden, this impossible truth, it presses down on me, demanding release. The police sketch, that mundane piece of paper, whispers a truth too grand, too terrifying, too holy to keep locked within my heart. It promises a story that challenges faith, reason, and perhaps even sanity. It's a story I must tell, beginning with that desperate boy, that praying woman, and the day the impossible light descended in our humble chapel, and I realized with a soul-shaking certainty that it was an archangel, and that the world, as I knew it, was forever changed. The police sketch, a stark, two-dimensional rendering of a face marked by struggle and fear, now hangs in the precinct, a cold testament to a crime. But for me, for Father Michael, it was never just a sketch. It was Leo, not the hardened criminal the world now saw, but Leo, the boy whose tiny hands I had once held as I traced the sign of the cross on his forehead, his infant cries echoing softly through this very chapel's hallowed halls. I can close my eyes and still hear the gentle splash of holy water, feel the slickness of oil of chrism, see his mother's tear-filled eyes as she promised to raise him in the light of Christ. He was just a babe, swaddled in white, a promise of innocence and a future brimming with grace. I remember that day as if it were yesterday, the sunlight streaming through the stained glass depiction of St. Michael, bathing the baptismal font in a mosaic of jewel tones, a promise of protection for this newest Lamb of God. He was one of those children who brightened a room, quick to offer a hand, a shy smile, a thoughtful question. Leo served as an altar boy for a time, his earnest young face often peering around the corner of the sacristy door, eager for his duties, his small voice clear as a bell during the responses. He'd helped Mrs. Gable arrange the flowers for the altar, his fingers surprisingly delicate as he trimmed stems. I watched him grow, from a lanky boy tripping over his oversized shoes, to a young man, his shoulders broadening, his smile still present, but with a new, almost imperceptible shadow lurking behind his eyes. It was a shadow of worry, a silent precursor to the storm that would eventually engulf him. St. Michael's was more than just a church to Leo. It was a sanctuary, a second home, a place of peace from a life that, even then, was beginning to fray at the edges. The cracks began to show, subtle at first, like hairline fractures in ancient plaster. His family, though rich in love, was always poor in material wealth. His father, a man of quiet struggles and even quieter disappointments, eventually succumbed to the weight of his own burdens. He left one crisp autumn morning, a note on the kitchen table, a packed bag, and a gaping hole in the family's already fragile foundation. I remember the day his mother came to me, her eyes swollen with tears, her voice a raw whisper as she recounted the empty space beside her in bed, the silence in the mornings. Leo was barely a teenager then, but I saw the immediate transformation in him. The quick smile became a forced effort, the eagerness dulled. He carried himself with a new, premature gravity, as if the mantle of manhood had been thrust upon him years too soon. He became the quiet, watchful son, taking on odd jobs after school, trying to fill the void that a man's absence leaves. He was always trying, always striving, always bearing a weight that was not his to carry. Then came the second blow, more insidious, more drawn out than the sudden departure of a father. His mother fell ill, a relentless, wasting sickness that devoured their meager savings and her dwindling strength. The medical bills piled up like unholy monuments to their suffering, each envelope a fresh stab of despair. Leo, by then a young man barely out of his teens, became her primary caregiver, her advocate, her sole support. He worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3, his body weary, his spirit slowly eroding under the constant pressure. I would see him in the back pews after the morning mass, his face etched with fatigue, his eyes scanning the bulletin for any mention of a community event, a fundraiser, any shred of hope that might lighten his load. His shoulders, once so confident, now seemed perpetually hunched, as if perpetually braced for the next blow. I saw the light in his eyes dim, slowly, irrevocably, replaced by a deep-seated weariness that no amount of sleep could cure. The young man I knew, full of potential and nascent faith, was slowly being consumed by the relentless grind of survival. It was a Tuesday, a week before the chapel was violated. The air was heavy with the coming autumn, a crispness that hinted at winter's harsh breath. I was putting away the vestments after morning mass when I saw him, hunched in the very last pew, almost swallowed by the shadows. His presence was so diminished, so unlike the bright boy I remembered, that I almost didn't recognize him. His usually neat hair was disheveled, his clothes clean but worn, hanging loosely on a frame that had grown alarmingly gaunt. There was no shy smile this time, only a face that was a raw mask of desperation. His skin pale, his lips chapped. "Leo," I called softly, my voice an intrusion in the chapel's sacred quiet. He flinched as if startled by a loud noise, then slowly turned. His eyes, once so bright and full of a quiet intelligence, were now clouded, haunted. They were the eyes of a man at the end of his rope, staring into an abyss. I walked down the aisle, the sound of my footsteps echoing too loudly in the silence until I stood beside him. "My son, what troubles you so deeply?" I asked, my heart aching with a familiar sorrow. I had seen this look before, on so many faces burdened by the world's cruelties, faces that had come to the church seeking solace, often finding little more than a temporary reprieve. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Father," he rasped, his voice rough, unused. I don't know where to turn anymore." The words tumbled out then, a torrent of shame and despair. He'd lost his job at the local diner, a place he'd worked since high school, a place that had always given him shifts no matter how tired he was. The owner, a kind man, had been forced to downsize. Leo was one of the first to go. They said I was a good worker, Father, but they had to cut back. My seniority wasn't enough. His voice cracked, thick with unshed tears. "And your mother?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. He shook his head, burying his face in his hands. "Worse, Father. Much worse. The new medication, it's so expensive. And the old one isn't working anymore. I owe so much, Father. More than I could ever earn." He lifted his head, his eyes pleading, yet utterly devoid of hope. "I've tried everything. Every job application, every soup kitchen, every community service. There's nothing left. They're going to cut off her treatment. They said they won't wait much longer for payment." He spoke of a darkness that was swallowing him whole, a palpable, suffocating gloom that had crept into every corner of his life. It wasn't just the financial ruin. It was the spiritual erosion, the insidious belief that he had somehow failed, that God had abandoned him. "I pray, Father, I do," he said, his voice barely audible. "But it feels like my prayers just hit the ceiling and fall back down, like there's no one listening, like I'm meant to drown." I listened, my heart heavy as he poured out the agony of his soul. I offered him what I could, words of comfort, prayers, a warm meal from the rectory kitchen, and a small sum from the parish poor box, all that was available at that moment. It was a paltry sum against the mountain of his debt, a gesture, I knew, that barely scratched the surface of his overwhelming need. I saw the gratitude in his eyes, but it was overshadowed by a deeper, more profound despair. He accepted the meal and the money with a weary nod, but his gaze remained fixed on some distant, unseen point, a place of no return. "God is with you, Leo," I insisted, placing a hand on his trembling shoulder. "He never abandons his children. We will find a way, son. We will pray. We will seek solutions." But even as I spoke the words, they felt hollow, inadequate in the face of such raw, crushing hopelessness. I saw in his eyes that he no longer believed me, perhaps no longer believed in the very possibility of divine intervention. He had tried, he had prayed, he had struggled with all his might, and still the darkness pressed in, relentless and unforgiving. He stood to leave, a shadow slipping silently through the chapel doors, leaving behind an emptiness that felt colder than the encroaching autumn. He believed, I knew, that he was a man beyond saving, a soul so lost that even God's light could no longer find him in the depths of his despair. He believed he was destined to sink, dragging his beloved mother down with him. And in that moment, watching him disappear into the gray afternoon, a knot of fear tightened in my own chest, a premonition of the terrible choice he was about to make, a desperate act born not of malice, but of the ultimate soul-crushing loss of hope. I had offered prayers, a meal, and what little I could from the parish poor box, but I see now that he believed he was a man beyond saving, a soul so lost that even God's light could no longer find him. He was already adrift, cast away from the shore, reaching for anything, even the impossible, the unforgivable, that might keep his head above the black, icy waters of his desperation. He was already adrift, cast away from the shore, reaching for anything, even the impossible, the unforgivable, that might keep his head above the black, icy waters of his desperation. The metaphor haunted me, a chilling echo in the quiet chambers of my own spirit. I had seen that look in men's eyes before, the frantic, almost animalistic glint of a soul truly lost, scrambling for purchase on a sheer cliff face with nothing but the vast, cold void below. To witness it in Leo, a child of this very parish, whom I had baptized, confirmed, and watched grow from a bright-eyed boy to a young man burdened beyond his years, was a particular agony. He was lost to a current too strong for his young shoulders, swept away by forces of poverty, illness, and abandonment that I, in my pastoral capacity, had felt woefully inadequate to stem. And as I watched him go that day, his steps heavy and his gaze averted, a profound ache settled in my chest, a spiritual counterweight to the unmoored despair I felt radiating from him like a palpable chill. It was a familiar ache for a priest, the burden of souls entrusted to one's care, especially those who seem to slip through one's fingers despite every prayer, every word of counsel, every outstretched hand. It felt like a small, precious ship setting sail on a stormy sea, knowing it was likely headed for wreckage. I prayed for a lifeline for Leo, a miracle to pluck him from the churning depths, not fully realizing then, in my limited human understanding, that God had already placed one, quietly and faithfully, in the very heart of our chapel, a lifeline named Eleanor. Eleanor Gable has been the keeper of our afternoon silence for 40 years. It sounds almost poetic, doesn't it? A title born not of any official capacity, no grand induction or public acclamation, but earned through an unwavering gentle constancy that was as much a part of St. Michael's as the rough-hewn oak of the confessionals, the worn velvet of the kneelers, and the evocative timeless scent of old wood, beeswax, and sacred incense that clung to the air. Her presence infused the very fabric of the chapel with a palpable sense of peace, a quality that lifted the silence beyond a mere absence of sound, transforming it into a sacred space, a vessel for communion. Every day, without fail, as the grandfather clock in the rectory hall chimed a low, sonorous 3 times, its deep tones reverberating through the stone walls, marking the hour of divine mercy, Eleanor would be there. Not sometimes, not often, but always. Her consistency was a quiet marvel, a testament in itself. In a world that ceaselessly glorifies haste and distraction, where the sacred often struggles to find a foothold amidst the clamor of the profane, Eleanor was a steadfast beacon. She was a fixture, a living, breathing testament to devotion, a silent rebuke to the fleeting loyalties and fragmented attention spans that characterize so much of modern life. I often observed her, sometimes from the sacristy doorway, its heavy oak door ajar just enough for me to peer out unseen, sometimes from the very back of the empty nave, feeling a quiet reverence for her profound spiritual discipline. It was not a performative piety, but a deeply personal, almost intimate act, observed perhaps only by God and inadvertently by her humble priest. She'd move with a delicate, almost ethereal grace down the central aisle, her sensible, well-worn shoes making barely a whisper on the cold marble, a sound so faint it seemed absorbed by the centuries of prayer embedded in the stones. Each step was unhurried, deliberate, a quiet progression towards the heart of the chapel. Her posture, even at 83, was remarkably straight, a testament not to physical rigidity, but to a life lived with purpose and dignity, her spirit unbowed by the inevitable passage of time. She carried no grand prayer books, no elaborate devotions with their myriad ribbons and dog-eared pages, only her small, smooth set of rosary beads. They were dark, made of a simple, unassuming wood, polished by decades of prayer until they gleamed with a soft, worn luster, reflecting the dim light of the sanctuary. They clicked softly, rhythmically, in her delicate, arthritic fingers, each sound a punctuation mark in her silent dialogue with God, a sacred metronome marking time in the eternal present. Where every moment is an opportunity for grace, she always chose the front pew, the very first one, directly before the tabernacle. It was a place of honor, of intimacy, a chosen proximity to the real presence that bespoke a deep, personal relationship. The tabernacle, a small golden altar in itself, gleamed softly, housing the consecrated host, the true body of Christ. Eleanor's choice was not about seeking attention, but about seeking closeness. There she would kneel. Her back, though straight, would soften into the slight curve of humility, a posture of profound reverence. Her head bowed just so, a whisper of silver hair escaping from beneath her dark, sensible scarf, catching the light like a thread of spun moonlight. The light itself, filtering through the vibrant reds, blues, and golds of our chapel's ancient stained glass window depicting St. Michael the Archangel vanquishing Satan, would often catch her in that pew. It bathed her in a kaleidoscope of divine hues, painting her profile with a holiness that transcended the ordinary. In those moments, she seemed less a woman of flesh and bone, and more a living icon, a vibrant, breathing stained glass portrait of faith itself, illuminated from within. The dust motes, usually unnoticed, danced in the sunbeams around her, appearing like tiny celestial particles, mirroring the fervent, silent prayers, ascending from her heart. Eleanor was a widow, her beloved husband, Thomas, having passed nearly 30 years prior. Theirs had been a quiet love story, one of shared burdens and simple joys, rooted deeply in their shared Catholic faith. Thomas, a gentle carpenter by trade, had built many of the altar furnishings in the chapel himself, and I remembered his hands, strong and calloused, yet deft with delicate wood. After his passing, some might have retreated into bitterness or despair, allowing grief to harden their hearts. But Eleanor, in her inimitable way, found solace and renewed purpose in an even deeper communion with God. Her sorrow was not denied, but transformed, offered up as a living sacrifice woven into the fabric of her devotion. Her life, once intimately shared, became a life of quiet service, volunteering at the parish soup kitchen on Mondays, her nimble fingers preparing countless meals, knitting blankets for the homeless shelter on Wednesdays, each stitch a silent prayer for warmth and comfort. And of course, her daily vigil in the chapel. She was not a woman of many words, her voice a soft, gentle murmur, often barely above a whisper, but her presence spoke volumes. It was a language of peace, of patience, of unwavering trust in God's providence, a sermon without a single spoken word. Her faith wasn't loud or performative, you see. There was no grandstanding, no effusive declarations, no need for an audience beyond the silent host in the tabernacle and perhaps the listening heart of God. It was not the faith that clamors for attention, seeking validation from earthly eyes, but the kind that is woven into the very fabric of one's being, as essential as breath, as deep and abiding a presence as the scent of old wood and beeswax. It was the kind of faith that sustains, that endures, that stands firm against the shifting sands of life's trials and sorrows. It was the quiet, constant hum of a soul utterly given over to God, a deep wellspring of peace in a world so often parched by anxiety, so often fractured by doubt. I often thought of Eleanor as a spiritual anchor for our parish, her very existence a testament to the constancy of grace. In the swirling currents of modern life, with its endless demands and distractions, her daily practice was a profound testament to the power of stillness, of intentionality. She understood, perhaps more acutely than any of us, the profound truth of the divine mercy, the sacred hour between 3 p.m. and 4 p.m., when, as our Lord revealed to Saint Faustina, the graces of His mercy are most abundantly poured out upon humanity. She didn't just believe it, she embodied it, becoming a conduit for those graces. In those moments, kneeling alone or nearly alone in the chapel, the vast emptiness of the nave around her seeming to amplify her quiet intensity, Eleanor was not merely praying for herself. I felt certain she was praying for us all, for the struggling families, for the lost souls like Leo, for the sick, for the weary, for the very fabric of our community, for the intentions silently carried by every person who had ever walked through those chapel doors. Her hands, clasped around those smooth beads, were conduits for intercession, drawing down grace from the heavens to nourish the often barren ground of our earthly existence. She was, in essence, holding the space for God's mercy to manifest. The chapel itself seemed to respond to her presence. Without her, the silence felt empty, a mere absence of sound, a hollow echo. With her, it became charged, sacred, a profound embrace, as if the very air vibrated with the presence of angels unseen. The old wooden pews, groaning softly under the weight of history, seemed to sigh with contentment in her presence. Even the statues, Saint Michael ever vigilant with his sword, his gaze fixed on some unseen evil, the Blessed Mother gazing with maternal tenderness from her niche, seemed to lean in as if listening to her silent petitions, their stone forms softened by the warmth of her unwavering faith. I recall one particularly challenging week, overwhelmed by administrative tasks and the quiet desperation of various parishioners, feeling my own spiritual well running dry. The weight of the world felt heavy upon my own shoulders, and I found myself doubting the efficacy of my own prayers, the strength of my own calling. I slipped into the chapel hoping for a moment of quiet solace, a simple respite from the incessant demands. Eleanor was there, of course, in her usual pew, a small, still point of light in the dimness. As I watched her, a profound sense of peace washed over me, not because she was doing anything outwardly remarkable, but simply because she was. Her steadfastness was a balm to my weary soul. A gentle reminder that faith wasn't always about grand gestures or soaring sermons, but often about the quiet, persistent, everyday offering of oneself to God. It was a reassurance that even when the shepherd felt weary, felt lost, there were always faithful sheep, like Eleanor, who, through their unwavering devotion, sustained the flock, and indeed, the very pasture itself. She was a living parable of endurance, a testament to the quiet power of prayer, a spiritual oasis in a desert of doubt. And now, thinking back to Leo, drifting away on his ocean of despair, I realized the stark, almost unbearable irony of that particular Tuesday afternoon. Leo, convinced he was beyond saving, believed he needed to take, to seize, to grasp at something tangible, something immediate, even if it meant violating the sacred, desecrating a holy space, and betraying the trust of his childhood parish. He was a starving man, desperate for sustenance, and seeing no other way, reached for what he perceived as a last resort, a desperate act of theft. Eleanor, by contrast, embodied the very essence of waiting, of receiving, of trusting. She represented everything Leo had lost, everything he desperately needed but could no longer perceive: hope, peace, and an unshakable faith that God would provide. Her life was a testament to patience, to the belief that grace would come, not through seizing but through surrender, not through force but through humble petition. She was the tangible embodiment of God's quiet faithfulness, a living icon of the very virtues Leo had allowed despair to strip from his soul. It was her prayerful silence that Leo shattered, not with a shout, but with the clatter of fear and the intrusion of violence. It was the tranquility she had cultivated in that sacred space, nurtured over decades, that he was about to desecrate. And it was her life, a life so devoted, so quietly impactful, that hung in the balance when his desperation finally overflowed, spilling into the hallowed ground of St. Michael's. The contrast could not have been more profound. The raw, frantic energy of a young man utterly devoid of hope, hurtling towards a desperate act, about to collide head-on with the quiet, unwavering resolve of an elderly woman who had made hope her daily bread. I remember thinking, as I felt the premonition of Leo's coming storm deep in my bones, a cold tremor that went beyond mere intuition, that if anyone deserved God's protection, it was Eleanor. Not because she was perfect or without sin, for we are all fallen creatures, but because her life itself was a living prayer, a constant offering, a profound witness to unyielding faith. She was the vulnerable yet unyielding heart of the chapel's devotion, a frail vessel holding an unbreakable spirit. The thought of that precious stillness, that decades-long vigil, being violently interrupted, filled me with a primal dread, a protective instinct born of my priestly vows. It felt like an attack not just on a person, but on the very essence of quiet faith, on the sanctity of our most vulnerable and profound moments with God. It felt like a violation of trust, a tearing of the sacred veil that separates the holy from the mundane. How fragile peace can be, I reflected, especially in a world that often seems to conspire against it, to drag it into the mire of chaos and despair. Yet Eleanor's presence taught me that true peace, born of faith, is not easily broken. It is a deep-rooted thing, capable of withstanding storms, even if the branches might sway and the leaves scatter in the gale. Her faith was not a fragile bloom, but an ancient tree. The question then was not whether her faith would break, but what would happen when the irresistible force of Leo's desperation, born of human suffering, met the immovable object of Eleanor's quiet devotion, sustained by divine grace. What would transpire when the raw wound of human suffering, festering in Leo's heart and manifesting as desperate violence, burst open in the very place where healing was sought most earnestly? The stage, unbeknownst to any of us, was set for a confrontation that would test the very limits of human despair and divine intervention. A moment when the quiet prayers of a faithful soul would either be crushed beneath the weight of worldly darkness, or unbelievably answered in a way no one could have ever foreseen, a way that would alter the course of lives and indeed the very nature of faith itself. Within the hallowed walls of St. Michael's, the air in the chapel that afternoon was still and heavy, pregnant with the quiet hum of prayer that had settled into its very stones over centuries. It was a Tuesday, I recall, the sun dipping towards the western horizon, casting long golden fingers through the stained glass depiction of St. Michael, our patron, triumphing over the dragon. Dust motes danced in those slanting beams, tiny galaxies adrift in the sacred space, each one a silent witness to Eleanor Gable's unwavering devotion. I had retreated to the sacristy, as was my custom after the noonday office, to pore over the weekly bulletin, my mind wrestling with the usual parish concerns. The dwindling funds for roof repairs, the upcoming bake sale, the persistent theological query from young Martha about purgatory, the familiar scent of old wood, beeswax, and the faint, sweet memory of incense clung to the vestments hanging in their appointed places, a comforting balm to the weary spirit. The worn velvet kneeler beneath my feet, the faint gold leaf flaking from the ancient crucifix on the wall, the hushed murmur of the ventilation system, all contributed to a sense of enduring peace. A quietude that seemed to defy the clamor and disquiet of the world beyond our heavy oak doors. It was a peace, I reflected, that felt almost eternal, a stillness that seemed to cradle the soul, a promise of sanctuary in a fracturing world. But peace, I have learned through a lifetime of ministry, is a fragile vessel, easily shattered. It can be broken not by a thunderclap or a crashing wave, but by something far more insidious, a sound that rips through the fabric of quietude like a tear in fine silk. On that particular Tuesday, it was not a shout, nor a crash of breaking glass, but a sound far more chilling in its desperate vulnerability, a frantic, choked sob. It was a sound that shouldn't exist in such a space, a raw, primal expression of pain that violated the sacred stillness in a way no physical noise could. My pen, poised above the bulletin draft detailing the schedule for the upcoming Lenten retreat, froze. The rhythmic, comforting click of Mrs. Gable's rosary beads, a sound as constant and reassuring as my own breath in the chapel, had abruptly ceased. A prickle of unease, sharp and immediate, traced a cold path down my spine, tightening the muscles in my neck. That sob, it was raw, uncontrolled, a sound born of an anguish so profound it seemed to pull the very air from the room, leaving a vacuum of dread in its wake. It was not a sound one expected to hear in the hallowed quiet of St. Michael's, a sanctuary built for solace, for communion, for quiet reflection, not for this kind of shattering despair, this rending of the soul's deepest pain. The very stones seemed to absorb the sound, holding it, amplifying its horror in the sudden, echoing silence that followed, a silence that felt heavier, more oppressive than any noise could have been. I pushed back my chair, the scrape of wood against the sacristy floor sounding unnaturally loud, abrasive in the newfound quiet. My heart began to pound with an unwelcome urgency, a rapid thrumming against my ribs that seemed to mock the solemnity of my surroundings. Stepping out from the shadowed confines of the sacristy, my eyes, accustomed to the dim religious light within, struggled for a moment to adjust to the sun-drenched nave, which now felt less like a haven, and more like a stage for an unfolding tragedy. And then I saw them. He stood by the altar rail, his back to the tabernacle, a figure alien and terrifying amidst the familiar iconography of saints and angels. A ski mask, dark and featureless, obscured his face, transforming him into an anonymous silhouette of menace, stripping away any hint of individual identity, making him a symbol of generalized threat. But it was his hand, trembling violently, that held my gaze, for clutched within its white-knuckled grip was a small, dark pistol. It looked menacingly out of place, an ugly metallic shard of the world's harsh cruelty brought into the gentle embrace of the chapel, defiling the very air with its presence. My breath caught in my throat, a dry, rasping sound. This was not a nightmare, this was real, and it was happening here, in the very heart of our sacred space, a place I had dedicated my life to protecting. The light which moments before had seemed so benevolent, now seemed to highlight the stark reality of the weapon, glinting dully off its cold metal, casting sharp, unsettling shadows. His eyes, visible through the crude openings in the mask, darted nervously around the chapel, wild with a desperate energy that spoke of an animal trapped and cornered, lashing out in its fear. He was pointing the pistol, not at me but at the offering box, the simple wooden chest secured beside the main entrance, where parishioners deposited their offerings of thanksgiving and charity. It was a humble box, usually containing only modest sums, a testament to the quiet generosity of our working-class community. His voice, when it came, was muffled by the mask, but the underlying tremor of panic, the raw edge of terror, was unmistakable, a high-pitched, almost childlike demand that ripped through the air, scarring its sacred stillness. "Open it! Hurry!" The urgency in his tone was laced with an almost unbearable strain, as if the words themselves were tearing him apart from the inside, each syllable a fresh wound. And there, in the front pew, exactly where she had knelt for 40 years at the hour of divine mercy, was Eleanor Gable. She was frozen, a tableau of terror so profound it seemed to have carved itself into the very air around her. Her slight frame, usually so vital and poised, now seemed impossibly rigid, her spine impossibly straight, as if any movement would shatter the fragile spell that held her. Her hands, which only moments before had been gracefully turning her rosary beads, had flown up, clasped together so tightly her knuckles were white, pressed against her lips as if to stifle a scream, or perhaps to hold in a prayer that refused to be silenced even in the face of such overwhelming fear. Her eyes, wide and luminous with a mixture of fear and something else, an unyielding astonishment, a bewildered questioning of the inexplicable, were fixed on the masked figure, a gaze that spoke volumes of a life lived in faith, now confronted by its absolute antithesis. The small, dark crucifix of her rosary, usually nestled in the palm of her hand, lay forgotten on the polished wood of the pew beside her, a silent, abandoned witness to the desecration, a symbol of broken peace. The contrast was stark and heartbreaking. The quiet, steadfast faith of an old woman, now facing the raw, unreasoning desperation of a young man. It was as if the two poles of human experience, absolute trust and absolute despair, had collided in this sacred space, threatening to unravel everything. A cold wave of recognition, swift and nauseating, washed over me. Despite the mask, despite the gun, despite the terror, I knew him. The slight build, the hesitant slump of his shoulders, the very tremor in his hands, the way he held his breath, the subtle tension in his stance, these were markers too familiar, too deeply etched into my memory to be mistaken. It could only be Leo, the boy whose baptism I had performed in this very parish, the child I had watched grow, quick with a smile even as shadows began to gather in his life. He was not a stranger but a lost lamb, now become a wolf in his own desperation. The overwhelming feeling that suffocated me then was not just fear for Mrs. Gable or for myself, though those were present, immediate, but a profound, aching sense of failure. A spiritual failure. I had known his struggles, had seen the darkness gathering at the edges of his soul, had tried to offer what comfort and aid I could from the meager parish poor box. I had offered counsel, prayer, and the meager resources of our community. But his eyes, I now realized, had always held a flicker of something I couldn't quite reach, a shadow I couldn't dispel, a private grief that had festered unhealed. But it clearly hadn't been enough. He stood before me now, a testament to a soul so lost, so consumed by fear and rage, that he had believed himself beyond saving. He was no longer the child whose innocent brow I had marked with the sign of the cross. He was a stranger, cloaked in despair and the chilling anonymity of his desperation, his very presence a raw wound in the heart of our sanctuary. "Leo," I said, my voice, I hoped, steady, though my knees felt like water beneath my cassock, and my own breath seemed shallow and quick, each intake a conscious effort. I took a step forward, hands held open, palms up, in a gesture of peace, of surrender, of appeal, but also, I confess, in a desperate attempt to bridge the chasm that had opened between us, to grasp at some last shred of humanity that might remain. "Leo, my son, what are you doing? Please, stop this. This isn't you." The name, Leo, seemed to hang in the air, a whisper that carried a lifetime of shared moments, of childhood smiles and adolescent anxieties, of confession and counsel, of shared meals and simple conversations in the parish hall. It was a lifeline, flung across the chasm of his terror and my own, a desperate hope that some shred of the boy I knew, the gentle soul beneath the mask, could still hear me, could still respond to the sound of his own name, to the voice of his shepherd. He flinched, a subtle jerk of his shoulders, and the pistol wavered slightly, a small, involuntary movement that spoke volumes of his internal conflict, of the battle raging within him, tearing at his resolve. Don't call me that," he stammered, his voice still muffled, but now laced with a raw edge of panic and a hint of something else. Shame, perhaps, a desperate desire to maintain his anonymity, to escape the burden of his past self, to be truly unknown in this moment of unforgivable action. "Just open the box, Father, please. I just need the money. I won't hurt anyone." His gaze darted back to Mrs. Gable, then away, quickly, as if unable to meet the silent, terror-filled accusation in her eyes, or perhaps the profound disappointment that his actions would surely cause her, a woman whose kindness he surely knew. The very admission, "I won't hurt anyone," sounded less like a promise, a vow of restraint, and more like a desperate plea to himself, a fragile, trembling boundary he was perilously close to crossing, a defense against the horror of his own escalating actions. My heart ached with an intensity that bordered on physical pain, a crushing weight in my chest. I could almost feel the suffering radiating from him, the shame, the profound humiliation that must have driven him to this desperate act. This wasn't a hardened criminal. This was a boy pushed to the absolute precipice, a soul on the verge of splintering, unraveling under the crushing weight of circumstance. "Leo," I repeated, softer this time, taking another slow, deliberate step, narrowing the distance between us, praying that proximity might somehow break through the wall of his fear and rage, that the sheer weight of our shared history might pierce his desperate facade. "Look at me, son. You don't have to do this. Whatever it is, we can find another way. We can talk. Please just put the gun down." My voice was a prayer, a plea for reason, for memory, for the grace that I hoped still resided within him. I was trying to reach past the ski mask, past the trembling hand and the menacing weapon, to the soul I had nurtured, however imperfectly, since his earliest days. I imagined stripping away the mask, seeing his face, his eyes, and reaching for the frightened child within, for the boy who had once served at this very altar, whose eager hands had helped prepare the Eucharistic feast. God can help you, Leo. He always can. Just let me help you. This isn't the answer, my son. This will only lead to more pain. His visible eye twitched, a frantic, almost tick-like movement, mirroring the internal storm, the inner turmoil that raged behind the dark fabric. For a fleeting moment I saw a profound vulnerability there, a glint of the lost boy who had poured out his worries to me only a week prior, the lost job, the mountain of medical bills for his ailing mother. The crushing weight of a darkness he felt was swallowing him whole, rendering him invisible and unheard, pushing him to the brink of utter despair. He had spoken then of feeling beyond saving, a soul so lost that even God's light could no longer find him. And now, here he was, proving his own grim prophecy, or so he believed, trapped in the very act he thought would free him, but which only bound him tighter in the chains of his despair. The chapel, which had always been a refuge, a haven of peace, was now, for him, merely a means to an end, a source of last desperate resort. My words, meant to soothe and console, to offer a path to redemption, seemed only to agitate him further, pushing him deeper into the corner of his own making, exacerbating his panic. The air in the chapel crackled with the unbearable tension of the moment. The silence was not peaceful anymore, but taut, humming with unspoken fear and a potent, sorrowful understanding that no amount of words could assuage. Mrs. Gable remained utterly motionless, her gaze unwavering, a silent sentinel of faith witnessing the unthinkable, a small, frail figure against a backdrop of encroaching darkness, embodying a quiet defiance. Her quiet strength, usually a comfort, now felt like a fragile barrier against a raging storm, a barrier that I, with all my priestly authority and all my pastoral heart, was failing to reinforce, failing to defend. And I, her priest, the shepherd of this flock, felt utterly impotent. My words, my pleas, seemed to bounce off the wall of Leo's desperation, finding no purchase, no path to the boy I once knew, no way to pierce the thick protective shell of his fear and anger. It was a harrowing realization, a moment of profound spiritual loneliness, as if the very air had thickened around us, making communication impossible, isolating each of us in our own separate terror. My mind raced, searching for the right words, the right argument, the right appeal to reason or to faith. But my tongue felt thick, my thoughts scattered by the sheer visceral horror of the situation. Every second stretched into an eternity, filled with the terrifying potential of his next move, the chilling emptiness of his masked face. He was beyond me, beyond my words, beyond my ability to console or to guide. The only thing that remained was the hard, cold glint of the pistol, and the unyielding, desperate demand in his voice. I said, "Hurry!" He barked, his voice losing its tremor, hardening into something ugly and unfamiliar, stripped bare of any lingering hint of the child I remembered. The gun, which had wavered, now steadied, pointing directly and unequivocally at the lock on the offering box, an insistent, unyielding menace. The hope I had clutched onto, the belief that my words could somehow reach him, that reason or compassion could prevail, began to crumble, giving way to a chilling, undeniable certainty. This was no longer a conversation, it was a command, backed by the undeniable authority of cold steel, an ultimatum delivered in a sacred space. My pleas were useless. He had made his choice, and now, it seemed, I had no choice but to comply. The weight of that realization, the bitter taste of my own inadequacy, of my failure to protect, to prevent, settled upon me like a shroud. The peace of St. Michael's, which had felt so eternal moments ago, was now utterly, irrevocably broken. My pleas were useless. He had made his choice, and now, it seemed, I had no choice but to comply. The weight of that realization, the bitter taste of my own inadequacy, of my failure to protect, to prevent, settled upon me like a shroud. The peace of St. Michael's, which had felt so eternal moments ago, was now utterly, irrevocably broken. With a sigh that felt torn from the depths of my being, a sound more akin to a ragged tear in the fabric of my spirit than a simple exhalation, I reached for the small ornate key that hung on a hook behind the sacristy door. It was a key I had used countless times to secure the day's humble offerings, to lock away the coins and folded bills left by parishioners, never imagining it would be demanded of me under such dire circumstances. Each movement felt sluggish, heavy with a grief that pressed in on me, not just for the violation of our sacred space, but for the boy, Leo, who stood before me, so utterly lost in the maelstrom of his despair. The metallic chill of the key against my fingertips sent a shiver through me, a premonition of the cold dread that was yet to fully bloom. I turned from the sacristy, the key now clutched in my trembling hand, and made my way to the large wooden offering box, carved with a simple cross, that stood near the sanctuary. The light from the stained glass window, usually a source of comfort, now seemed to cast the scene in a stark, unforgiving glow, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the air, oblivious to the human drama unfolding beneath them. I could feel Leo's eyes on me, or rather, the empty, demanding gaze of the mask that obscured his features. His body was tense, coiled, like a spring wound too tight, ready to snap. "Hurry!" His voice when it came was not a shout, but a strained whisper, thick with desperation, edged with a frantic impatience that made my heart ache. It was the sound of a man drowning, flailing wildly, dragging everything down with him. I imagined the fear and shame that must have been warring within him, twisting him into this unrecognizable figure. My hands, usually steady as I prepared the host or lifted the chalice, fumbled slightly with the lock. The click, when it finally engaged and yielded, echoed unnaturally loud in the sudden, taut silence of the chapel. I pulled open the small, hinged door of the box, revealing its modest contents: a handful of crumpled bills, a scattering of loose change, the everyday generosity of our parishioners, a testament to their own struggles and their enduring faith. It was, I knew, a paltry sum in the face of what Leo must have been hoping for, what he truly needed. It was barely enough for a few days' groceries, let alone the mountain of medical bills and the crushing debt he carried. Leo stepped forward then, his movements jerky, the gun still held with an unsteady hand, though it was no longer aimed at me but generally towards the box. He didn't wait for me to step back but rather reached in, his masked face turning slightly as if he expected more, as if the box might reveal a hidden compartment, a secret trove that would solve all his woes. His fingers, rough and quick, swept the contents into a pocket of his oversized hoodie. The dull clink of coins against fabric seemed to mock the grandeur of the chapel, a pathetic counterpoint to the sacred silence. When he withdrew his hand, the emptiness of the box, like the emptiness in his eyes, was palpable. He glanced at the meager handful of money he had acquired, then back at the open, barren box, and a low guttural sound escaped him, a mix of frustration and utter despair. His shoulders slumped, and the rage that had been simmering beneath his desperation now seemed to boil over. It wasn't enough. It would solve nothing. This desperate, violent act, this terrible desecration, had yielded nothing but a handful of coins and a deepening sense of his own ruin. The realization seemed to hit him with the force of a physical blow. His head snapped back slightly as if struck. I watched him, my breath held captive in my chest, feeling the crushing weight of his failure, a failure that now felt inextricably linked to my own, to the parishes, to the very world that had so abandoned him. The air in the chapel, thick with the scent of old wood and the lingering incense from morning mass, suddenly felt heavy, suffocating. He began to back away, his movements less deliberate now, more a desperate, stumbling retreat. The gun, which had seemed so ominously steady moments ago, now wavered slightly in his hand, a barometer of his own inner turmoil. His eyes darted around the chapel, perhaps searching for an exit, perhaps seeing the futility of his actions reflected in the stillness of the pews. He was a cornered animal, wounded and lashing out, but now only more deeply wounded by his own strike. My gaze, which had been fixed on Leo, involuntarily flickered to Mrs. Gable. She was still in her front pew, frozen, a statue of terror and unyielding faith. Her rosary beads, which had been clasped tightly in her hands, now lay loosely draped between her fingers, glistening softly in the dim light. Her face, usually so serene, was a mask of shock, her eyes wide, glistening with unshed tears, fixed on the chaotic scene before her. She was a woman of habit, of routine, and this violent rupture of her sacred afternoon vigil must have felt like the end of the world itself. As Leo continued to back towards the heavy oak doors, his gaze briefly swept over Mrs. Gable. It was a fleeting glance, devoid of specific malice, yet charged with the chaotic energy of his unraveling. And then, it happened. A small, involuntary sound escaped Mrs. Gable's lips, a gasp. It was barely audible, a fragile whisper of air escaping her constricted throat, a tiny ripple in the vast ocean of silence that had enveloped us. But in that hyper-alert, tension-filled space, it was amplified, a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the strained quiet like a knife. It was enough. In his panic, his raw, unthinking terror, Leo spun around. It was a sudden, violent pivot, fueled by adrenaline and the desperate need to control a situation that was spiraling irrevocably out of his grasp. The movement was a blur of dark fabric and glinting metal, a sudden, horrifying shift in the landscape of our terror. The gun, which had been pointed vaguely towards the door, now settled with chilling precision, leveled directly at Mrs. Gable. My breath hitched. My heart, which had been pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs, seemed to seize in my chest, a sudden cold knot of dread. The air left my lungs in a silent whoosh. In that instant, time seemed to stop. The world narrowed to that single, horrific tableau. Leo, frozen mid-turn, his arm extended, the dark, predatory eye of the pistol fixed on the fragile figure of Mrs. Gable, whose face had gone utterly, terrifyingly blank. Her eyes, still wide, held a profound, heartbreaking vulnerability. She was no longer just a witness. She was the target. I saw it all with horrifying clarity. I saw the terrible, irreversible sin about to be committed. Not merely a physical act, not just a shedding of innocent blood, though that was certainly part of it. No, this was something deeper, a spiritual defilement that would scar not only the victim and the perpetrator, but the very sanctity of the chapel, the soul of our community, and the heart of God. To harm Eleanor, a woman who had dedicated her life to quiet devotion, a vessel of unwavering faith, was an act of profound sacrilege. It was a shattering of grace, a descent into an abyss from which I feared Leo would never return. His soul, already teetering on the precipice, would be cast into a darkness so complete, so self-inflicted, that even divine mercy might struggle to reach him. My mind raced, a frantic, futile swirl of thoughts. No! Not here! Not her! Not Leo! I tried to move, but my limbs felt weighted. encased in concrete. There was no time for reason, no chance for escape. The distance between Leo and Mrs. Gable was too short, the gun too swift, his desperation too absolute. Any move I made, any shouted warning, any desperate lunge, would only hasten the terrible outcome. I was a priest, a shepherd, sworn to protect my flock, yet I was utterly, devastatingly impotent. The words of Scripture, the wisdom of centuries, the comforting rituals of faith, all seemed to crumble in the face of this raw, visceral threat. My theological training, my pastoral experience, meant nothing in this moment of primal, terrifying confrontation. The silence that followed Mrs. Gable's gasp was not empty, but thick with the unspoken horror of what was about to transpire. It stretched, taut and agonizing, each fraction of a second expanding into an eternity. I could hear the frantic beat of my own heart in my ears, a muffled drumbeat of impending doom. The image of Leo's trembling hand, the dark glint of the pistol, Mrs. Gable's frozen, terrified face. It branded itself onto my soul with an excruciating clarity. In that profound instant of helplessness, when all human avenues were closed, when my own strength and wisdom had proven utterly insufficient, I closed my eyes. I did not do so in resignation, not as an act of surrender to despair, but as a deliberate turning away from the horror, a desperate pivot towards the only source of true power I knew. I closed my eyes not to escape, but to focus, to condense every fiber of my being, every ounce of my faith, into a single, undeniable plea. I prayed, not with words, no, for words were too small, too constrained, too human for the magnitude of the moment. My tongue was dry, my throat constricted, my mind a blank canvas upon which only terror had been painted. This was not a prayer of recited liturgy or memorized petitions. This was a prayer that erupted from the deepest, most primal core of my soul, a raw, inarticulate cry that transcended language, a pure current of desperate appeal directly from my spirit to the heart of God. It was a soundless scream, a silent, guttural howl that tore through the very essence of my being. It was a prayer born of absolute despair and absolute faith, a paradox of human experience. It was the desperate plea of a finite being reaching out to the infinite, begging for intervention in a situation utterly beyond human remedy. My soul cried out for mercy, for justice, for a miracle. It was a desperate, unvarnished appeal to heaven to not let this sacred place be stained with innocent blood. "O Lord," I thought, or rather, felt, with an intensity that burned through my very bones, "if you are anywhere, if you are truly here, please, not like this, not now, not Eleanor, not Leo. Save them. Save us all." It was a prayer that held no conditions, no expectations, only the raw, unadulterated cry of a priest begging his God to manifest his power, his love, his mercy, in a world that seemed to have forgotten him. It was a plea for divine intervention, a desperate, heart-shattering appeal that, for one terrifying, eternal moment, was the only thing left in the universe. It was a plea for divine intervention, a desperate, heart-shattering appeal that, for one terrifying, eternal moment, was the only thing left in the universe. And then, it did not begin with a sound. No thunderclap ripped the heavens, no booming voice shattered the quiet of the chapel. Instead, it began with a cessation, a profound and absolute stopping of all sound. The frantic thrumming of my own heart, which had been a deafening drum against my ribs, simply stilled. The distant, almost imperceptible hum of the fluorescent lights, the creak of the old wooden pew where Eleanor knelt, the ragged intake of breath from Leo behind his mask, all of it dissolved into a vacuum, a silence so complete it felt less like an absence and more like a presence. It was the silence before creation, the hush of the universe holding its breath. Then came the change in the very quality of the air. It wasn't a gust of wind or a sudden chill, but a shift so subtle, so elemental, that it felt as if the air itself had softened, thickened, grown alive with an unseen current. The dusty motes that usually danced idly in the slanting sunlight through the stained glass window of St. Michael now seemed to hang suspended, caught in an invisible amber. My eyes, still squeezed shut in desperate prayer, felt an inexplicable warmth on my eyelids, a light so gentle it did not pierce but rather permeated. I opened them slowly, reluctantly, half expecting to find the scene unchanged, my prayer unheard, my hope a foolish whisper against the brutal reality of the gun. What I saw, what all three of us saw, defied every known law of physics, every rational explanation. A single mote of dust, caught in a sliver of sunlight high above the altar, began to glow. Not merely reflect, mind you, but to emanate light from its very core. It pulsed. A tiny, perfect star. A miniature sun burning with an impossible intensity, yet without heat, without consuming itself. Its color was a pure golden white, not the harsh, blinding white of an earthly lamp, but a luminous, pearlescent radiance that seemed to absorb all shadow, leaving only a soft, ethereal glow in its wake. My breath caught in my throat, not in fear, but in a dawning, stupefied awe. And then, another mote ignited, and another, like a celestial contagion spreading through the very fabric of the air. The tiny pinpricks of light multiplied, growing in number and intensity, until the entire chapel was no longer illuminated by light, but became light. It was as if the air itself had turned into liquid gold, shimmering, alive, and breathing. The ancient wooden pews, the worn stone floor, the familiar statues of saints, all seemed to glow from within, their forms softened, their details rendered with a clarity that transcended mere visibility. The stained glass windows, once merely beautiful images, now seemed to open into vast, unimaginable realms, their colors resonating with an inner fire. This was not the light of 1,000 suns, nor the searing brilliance of a divine flash. It was light that enveloped, light that cradled. It was brilliant beyond measure, yet it did not hurt our eyes. It soothed them, washed them clean, allowing us to see not just with our physical senses, but with something deeper, something in the soul. And within that profound silence, a new sensation began. It wasn't a sound heard with the ears, but a low, resonant hum that vibrated deep in my chest, a frequency that resonated through bone and sinew. It was a chord struck in the very core of my being, a soundless melody that spoke of infinite power and unimaginable peace. It was the harmony of the spheres, the quiet thrum of existence itself, now made palpable. My own heart, which had been so desperately pounding moments before, now beat in perfect rhythm with this universal pulse, slow and steady, infused with a serenity I had never known. The fear that had gripped me, that had made my hands tremble and my voice crack, dissolved like mist in the morning sun, replaced by an overwhelming sense of wonder, a profound reverence, and an inexplicable, boundless hope. The light which had filled every corner of the chapel began to coalesce, slowly, deliberately, as if drawn by an unseen hand. The golden white luminosity flowed and gathered in the space between Leo, frozen halfway to the door, and Mrs. Gable, still kneeling in the front pew, her rosary clutched to her chest. It wasn't a sudden, jarring formation, but a graceful, organic assembly, like vapor condensing into a cloud, or water shaping itself into a current. It swirled, denser and brighter, until it formed a column, a pillar of pure, living luminosity that stretched from the stone floor almost to the vaulted ceiling. It was not opaque, yet it was distinctly separate from the ambient glow, pulsing with a rhythm that seemed to mirror the hum vibrating in my chest. This column of light was not static. It pulsed and breathed, a beacon of power beyond all human comprehension, an active, dynamic force that radiated both an immeasurable majesty and an undeniable, tender presence. I watched, utterly mesmerized, my mind struggling to categorize what my eyes beheld, yet my spirit simply accepted. There was no questioning, no doubt. This was it. This was the answer to my desperate cry, to Eleanor's lifetime of unwavering faith, to Leo's agonizing despair. This was the manifestation of a power that had moved mountains and parted seas, now descending into our humble chapel, into the very heart of human brokenness. Every fiber of my being resonated with the truth. God was here. Not as a concept, not as a distant whisper, but as a tangible, blinding, awe-inspiring presence. Leo, who had been a statue of rage and fear, was now simply a statue. The light bathed him, enveloped him, and in its embrace, the taut lines of his masked face seemed to soften. His shoulders, once hunched in defensive aggression, now seemed to sag in bewildered surrender. His hand, which had held the small dark pistol with such menace only moments before, now hung limp, nerveless. In the profound ringing silence punctuated only by the inner hum, the gun clattered from his fingers. The sound, ordinarily sharp and metallic against the stone floor, was oddly muted, almost swallowed by the light itself, a final earthly noise giving way to the divine. It spun once, twice, a dark, insignificant thing, before coming to rest harmlessly by his feet, no longer a threat, no longer an instrument of despair, simply a forgotten piece of cold metal in a world now ablaze with the warmth of an impossible, undeniable miracle. The gun, a dark and impotent thing, lay at Leo's feet, forgotten in the sudden, overwhelming blaze. But the light, my friends, did not recede. Instead, it intensified, gathering itself not from an external source, but from within its own impossible brilliance. It was as if the very air, so recently thick with terror, was now weaving itself into something more substantial, more profound. The column of golden white light, which had earlier pulsed with an almost unbearable energy, began to coalesce, densifying in the space between Leo and the still frozen Mrs. Gable. It was not a violent, sudden shift, but a gentle, unfolding revelation, like the slow opening of a divine bloom. I watched, my breath held captive in my chest, as the luminosity within that pillar deepened, its edges sharpening, yet remaining soft, ethereal. It wasn't a solid form that emerged, not in the way we understand matter, but rather an essence, a concentrated presence that radiated power. Yes, but also a profound, ineffable peace. Its features were indistinct, hazy, as if gazing directly upon them would be too much for human eyes to bear. Yet the impression was undeniable. Masculine, strong, imbued with an ancient wisdom and an almost terrifying beauty. There were no feathered wings, no traditional trappings of our stained glass depictions, but the overwhelming sense of majesty, of something utterly other, yet intimately connected to the very fabric of creation, left no doubt. This was not of our world. This was a messenger, an emissary from the very heart of God. It did not speak with a voice that vibrated through the air, no thunderous pronouncements or gentle whispers from unseen lips. Instead, a message, clear and resonant, washed over us. It was a communication without words, a direct infusion into the very core of our beings. Absolute peace, profound and unconditional love, gentle yet unwavering. These were the currents that flowed from this incandescent form, filling the chapel, filling me, filling Mrs. Gable, and most profoundly, filling Leo. The terror that had gripped my heart, the helpless despair I felt for Leo, the unspoken fear in Mrs. Gable's eyes, all of it dissolved, not slowly but instantly, like shadows fleeing before the dawn. And with it I felt the rage that had consumed Leo. The desperate, blinding anger that had driven him to that terrible act. Simply cease. It was as though a fever had broken, leaving behind only the calm, cool clarity of dawn. My gaze, drawn by an irresistible force, followed the angels as it turned, slowly, majestically, to rest upon Leo. The boy, who moments before had been a statue carved from fear and desperation, now crumpled. The column of light enveloped him, embraced him, and in its embrace, the mask, that flimsy barrier he had hoped would conceal his identity, his pain, his shame, simply slipped from his face. It fell unheeded to the stone floor, revealing the pale, tear-streaked countenance of a child utterly broken, utterly undone. He sank to his knees, not in defiance, but in absolute agonizing surrender. The tears that streamed down Leo's face were not tears of fear, nor even tears of immediate relief. No, these were tears of a different order, a profound deluge of grief and repentance so raw, so utterly heartbreaking, that it pierced my soul. It was the soundless lament of a soul confronting the full magnitude of its fallenness, yet simultaneously experiencing the boundless grace that offered redemption. He wept for his lost innocence, for the suffering he had caused, for the path he had strayed, and for the incredible, undeserved mercy that now held him. His thin shoulders shook with silent sobs, and a low, almost guttural sound, like a wounded animal, escaped him. It was the sound of a heart breaking open, not from despair, but to let the light in. The angel held its gaze upon him, its form radiating that silent, loving message for what felt like an eternity, though in earthly time it could have been mere seconds. It was a silent benediction, a final wordless assurance that even in the darkest valleys, even when we believe ourselves beyond saving, God's light will always find us, always offer a path back. And then, as gently as it had arrived, the light began to recede. It didn't vanish with a flash or a bang, but rather diffused, softened, slowly retreating into the very air from which it had coalesced. The chapel walls slowly regained their familiar muted hues. The sunbeam from St. Michael's stained glass window, which had ignited this divine intervention, returned to its ordinary earthly glow, tracing patterns of color on the ancient stone. All that remained was the faint, clean scent of ozone, like the aftermath of a distant storm, and the three of us, utterly changed, forever marked by the impossible, undeniable miracle we had witnessed. Mrs. Gable slowly, tremulously, moved her hand to her chest, her rosary clutched tight, her eyes still wide with awe. Leo remained on his knees, his face buried in his hands, his sobs now softer, more exhausted, but still profound. And I, Father Michael, stood there, my legs trembling, my heart still pounding with the echo of that divine hum, irrevocably altered in my understanding of God's active presence in our world. The return to the mundane was abrupt. The distant wail of sirens, faint at first, then growing louder, pierced the fragile silence left by the angel's departure. Soon the chapel doors burst open, and two police officers, their faces grim, their movements efficient, entered. They found Leo still on his knees, his face tear-stained, the gun lying innocently by his feet. They found Mrs. Gable, pale but composed, her eyes still holding a hint of that otherworldly glow. And they found me, standing by the sacristy door, trying to articulate the inarticulable. I tried, in my shock and reverence, to explain what had happened, to describe the intervening force, the light, the presence. I spoke of strength, of justice, of an overwhelming sense of mercy that had disarmed the boy. But how does one describe an angel to men whose world is governed by forensics and facts? My words, undoubtedly fractured by the awe still ringing in my ears, were interpreted through their lens. They heard a second man, a powerful presence. They took my description of the masculine, indistinct yet powerful form, the one radiating peace, and translated it into the parameters of a criminal investigation. Later, when they presented me with a composite sketch drawn from my bewildered testimony, I saw it. The strong jawline, the intense eyes, the aura of undeniable authority. It was a face drawn with the skill of a police artist, intended to identify a fugitive. But for me it was a holy card, a paradoxical icon of the moment an armed boy was stopped cold, not by another man, but by the blinding, silent, terrifying, and utterly loving act of God. It was the face of the messenger. When the sirens finally wailed their earthly song, shattering the sacred silence that had swallowed our chapel, Leo offered no resistance. He stood, or rather sagged, amidst the scattered change from the offering box and the small dark pistol that lay where it had fallen, a silent testimony to a terror that had been utterly eclipsed. The ski mask had already dropped from his face, revealing eyes that were no longer wild with desperation, but wide and glistening with a profound, shuddering shame. He was a hollowed-out vessel, yes, the rage and desperation wrung from him, but there was something else too, a fragile, nascent peace, like the quiet aftermath of a storm. The police, bless their pragmatic hearts, saw only a young man caught in a desperate act, shaken by some unknown encounter. My fractured account of a powerful presence, of a blinding light, of a form of undeniable authority, was carefully distilled into their language of logic. An unidentified accomplice, they concluded, their pens scratching, who disarmed the suspect and fled the scene. That became the official record, neatly filed away, a clean, human-sized explanation for an utterly divine intervention. They drew their composite sketch, not of an archangel, but of a man, albeit a strangely compelling one, whose intervention they now sought. And I, looking at that drawing, a face of strength and purpose, knew with every fiber of my being what they had missed, what they couldn't possibly comprehend through their lens of evidence and motive. The days that followed were a blur of police reports, hushed conversations among bewildered parishioners, and the quiet, persistent hum of a miracle lingering in the chapel's hallowed air, felt more in the spirit than heard by the ear. Leo, bless his repentant heart, never denied what he had done. But he also spoke, quietly and hesitantly, of an unearthly force that had stopped him, a light that had not just blinded, but had burned the consuming darkness from his soul. My testimony, perhaps less bewildered by then, emphasized his profound remorse and the uncharacteristic nature of his actions, detailing his family's struggles and his descent into desperation. The judge, a man of surprising compassion and perhaps a touch of intuition, listened intently. Leo served a mercifully short sentence, the weight of his guilt, I believe, already a far heavier and more transformative punishment than any court could impose. But it was Eleanor Gable, our steadfast watcher in the front pew, who truly began the sacred work of mending. She visited Leo in the detention center, not with judgment or recrimination, but with a small worn rosary held gently in her hand and a gentle, unwavering gaze in her eyes. "We all lose our way sometimes, dear boy," she told him, her voice a soft balm. "But what matters is finding the path back." Her forgiveness, freely given, was a living echo of the boundless mercy we had all witnessed in the chapel. It was a grace as tangible as the light itself, paving the way not just for his freedom, but for his own profound path to redemption. Today, if you walk through the impeccably kept grounds of St. Michael's, you'll likely see Leo. He's our groundskeeper now, the quiet guardian of the very paths and sacred spaces he once sought to desecrate. He moves with a certain deliberate stillness, his hands, once trembling with a gun, now tending to the vibrant rose bushes that bloom near the chapel entrance, or meticulously sweeping the fallen leaves from the ancient stone steps. There's a quiet dignity in him, a profound humility that speaks volumes without a single word. His work is more than a job. It is a daily act of penance, a silent litany of gratitude for a second chance he knows, deep in his bones, he did not earn, but was given freely, miraculously. He still sits in the back pew sometimes, usually after the last funeral service or before the early morning mass, not with the desperation that once consumed him, but with a quiet, profound reverence, as if listening for that low, resonant hum, for the lingering whisper of grace that still echoes, for him, in this sacred space. The police sketch, that peculiar and utterly paradoxical artifact of a miracle, eventually came down from the precinct bulletin board. Perhaps the case was deemed cold, or simply too strange to pursue, vanishing into the archives of unsolved mysteries. But I kept a copy, tucked carefully into the well-worn, leather-bound pages of my breviary, a place where prayers and mysteries reside. It's a curious thing to carry such an image next to the very prayers of the Church. It reminds me daily that God's grace is not an abstract concept, confined to ancient texts or the static beauty of stained glass narratives. No, it is an active, intervening force, a living presence that can, in an instant, rend the veil of our ordinary, predictable reality. It descends not only into pristine cathedrals or the quiet solitude of a monk's cell, but into the mess and terror of our darkest moments, into a struggling boy's utter despair, into an old woman's silent, unwavering prayer, into a priest's helpless, raw cry for intervention. It doesn't always prevent us from falling, no, for that is often part of our human journey, our crucible, our learning. But it is always there, unfailingly, to be the light that shows us the way back home. It is the light that burns away the fear, that cleanses the anger, that heals the brokenness. It is the angel sent from God Himself to remind us that even when we feel most lost, most abandoned, we are never truly alone, and that mercy, boundless and eternal, awaits us all, patiently calling us back into its embrace.